Well, very excited today to introduce our speaker. We have just a theme of this year, reaching the cities, starting from our Global Mission Emphasis Week. I've chosen speakers throughout the year to come who have demonstrated in their lives a desire to reach the cities around the globe. And Dr. Russell Jeung, a good friend actually, he came and visited us in Beijing. He and his wife, now you have to understand, Dr. Russell Jeung himself is Chinese-American. The Chinese-American are always liking to go toward higher education, middle, upper class direction. Graduated from Stanford University and then got his, I think, PhD at UC Berkeley, got offered jobs in nice universities, but decided to move his family into East Oakland. You could actually, if you go on Christianity Today, you can read an article. I just read it this morning. Interesting. Just moved into a housing area where there's Cambodian kids running around and live chickens and everything. I mean, it's just a very interesting story. 20 years ago now has been living in the inner city of East Oakland. Now, the needs of the city are just tremendous. There's, of course, the drugs, the gangs, and prostitution, but just the children needing tutoring and opening up his home, kids coming through his living room. That's the life of someone who's given his life to the cities. So just a challenge for us as we're thinking of our future. We're inviting speakers primarily for us as we are preparing our lives after you graduate from Gordon-Conwell to go globally to any of the cities. But if you're going to be here in the U.S., there are other people that can do the suburbs. I just challenge you to consider giving your lives to the city. So let's welcome Russell. Russell, can you come? And let's give him a hand.
Okay, thanks, David. Do I get a clicker or do I forward it? Is there? Well, thank you, David, and I'd like to thank Dean Isaac for inviting me today, and for Karen for organizing a lot of this. I'm really excited for the opportunity to be here at Gordon-Conwell. I actually come from San Francisco State, a secular school, and they actually kicked off InterVarsity from our campus. So to see professors singing praise to God is just sort of a new experience for me. This morning, it's election day, and I think a lot about power. And for me, who have been living in the city, in the inner city for the last 20 years, I've been thinking a lot about issues of power and issues of justice. And I'd like to share some of the lessons I've learned, but not from how to use power, but lessons I've learned from my refugee neighbors, refugees who are powerless and exiles in this country. And so I'd like to introduce you to Baek Chom. He's the monk-like looking guy in the picture there. Baek Chom isn't actually a Buddhist monk. He's actually a native shamanist healer. And he went through the killing fields in Cambodia where a quarter of the country was killed by the government, either through starvation or through execution. He survived that, and he came to the United States as a refugee and got resettled into another killing field, Oakland, East Oakland, where we live, it's called the Murder Dubs. We're the most robbed neighborhood in the robbery capital of the USA. And so Baek Chom, I lived in an apartment across from him, in an apartment complex called Oak Park Apartments. And as David said, I moved in there about 20 years ago just to study gangs, but I liked it so much, and God taught me so much that I stayed there. And one of the things I liked about it was so colorful, it was so vibrant, and Baek Chom had all these interesting healing techniques. And he had this gigantic shrine in his apartment, so I would bring Berkeley students that I taught to meet him and just to show them a different sort of way of life. And one time I brought this cow football player. He was this gigantic 300-pound nose tackle who had a car accident. And he said, oh, I want to be healed because he wanted to play football again. And he learned that Baek Chom was a healer. So he asked Baek Chom, can you heal me? And Baek Chom said, sure. And then so Baek Chom started doing these chants, and he's made the football player kneel at the shrine. And then Baek Chom took this sort of sip of water, and I thought he was just taking a break from his chanting. But then he took the water and he spat all over the football player. All right, so he sprayed this mist of a spittle all over the football player. And I thought the nose tackle was actually going to tackle Baek Chom because he was this like big football player. But the football player, said, if anybody normally spat on me, like in a football field, I would beat him up. But because he was an elder, I refrained. So you could see, for Baek Chom as a refugee, he's sort of like a fish out of water, right? He totally doesn't fit into the United States context. If he wanted to be an effective healer, he'd have to change all his ways to be able to relate and to do well and to succeed in the United States. The interesting thing, though, for me, is that I think we, as Christians, especially in the United States, for me especially, who grew up in America, I have a lot to learn from refugees and for what it means to be a resident alien and an exile here on earth. And so that's what I want to share with you, what I've learned from Baek Chom, what he's taught me in our struggle for justice together and in our life together in the city. So the neighborhood and the apartment complex where we lived in Oak Park was a typical underclass apartment complex. And you can see from the pictures here, it was really ill-managed, so that when apartments became vacant, drug addicts would use the vacant apartments as shooting galleries. And so kids would then go in and play, and they could pick up needles like that, like in this picture. During El Nino in 1997, this year's an El Nino year, it rained a lot, and the place became even worse. It was dilapidated already, but because of the storms during that time, the whole apartment complex got flooded. And so some women had sewage backed up. There was like a fountain of sewage coming out of a person's toilet. This is someone's operating bathroom. You can see the broken windows, the holes in the walls, and the mold. The mold was really bad. The mold got so bad because of the rain and the moisture, and because there were so many cockroaches, kids got asthma. So Baek Chom's grandson, who lived with them, had to be hospitalized that winter because the asthma got so bad. That happened to 8 different households of kids. Different apartments had kids who actually had asthma attacks so severe. And so that year, we're living in this apartment complex. We're dealing with drug dealers and drug addicts. We're dealing with really bad housing conditions. And with me came another bunch of Christians. And the Christians who were living with us, we suffered through the same conditions as our neighbors. And actually, my favorite story is one time one of the Christians was, you know how you soap your feet when you take a shower and you lean against the wall? He fell through the wall because the wood had rotted so much and there was so much mold. So we Christians, we talked about this, and what would you do in this face of this type of housing condition? Think about what you would do, right? And so I would think most middle-class Americans would we'll just move out, right? I wouldn't stand for this. And we Christians, because we were committed and because we were wanted to stay in the community, we decided to sue our landlord. We thought that was the just thing to do, that God didn't want our neighbors to live like this, so we would use the powers we had, the privileges we had, the rights we had as Americans to sue. And so we sued. Now, it was easy for me to sue, but when we talked to our attorney said it would be better if you had a class action suit, if you had more people in your lawsuit. And so if you get people with the worst problems, like Baek Chom actually had to move out of his bedroom and live in his living room because the rain drained so much into his bedroom. And so the lawyer said, why don't you organize your neighbors? And so we started doing that. But we found out that it was really difficult to get our neighbors to fight for justice, to seek what we would call God's shalom and peace. One reason was that a lot of our neighbors were Cambodian, and they went through the killing fields, and the government killed them. So if they rocked the boat, they could get killed. And they were all on welfare, and they didn't want to lose their welfare benefits. And they were afraid if we rocked the boat, we could lose our welfare, and that would be our livelihood. The other half of our apartment complex were undocumented Latino day laborers. And if the landlord reported them, they could be deported, right? So there were these really severe political barriers to standing up for justice. But the major barrier for our tenants was that this was during the dot-com boom days, when things were really gentrifying, just like today. Things were gentrifying really quickly. And so we paid $450 a month for rent. And here, this is a picture of Bechtrom in the New York Times when his welfare was about to be cut. And he only got $550 to live off of. And so, $450 of his $550 was going to rent. If he lost this low-income housing, and let's say moved next door, he would have to pay $1,200. So he couldn't afford to complain, because if he complained, he'd have to move out of the city, and he would lose his community, right? So there are all these barriers for us to organize for what we thought was God's justice. But fortunately, God did a miracle for us. The landlord stupidly raised rents, and that made the people sort of more upset. Once one grandma started complaining, then the other grandmas who were trying to one-up her said, well, you think your apartment's bad, And once the grandmas started complaining, then we were able to rally our tenants. And so God's first miracle was we were able to organize our neighbors and form an unlikely tenants coalition. That God, through these sort of conditions, raised up Cambodian refugees, Latino day laborers who didn't speak each other's language, and about 10 Christians who were college educated. And we all got together and sued our landlord. So I thought that, oh, God's working. God's bringing justice. What happened, though, was that our landlord had power, too. And he was smart, and so he declared corporate bankruptcy. And that meant that in our case, we couldn't get any damages. He couldn't afford to fix up the building, so we were in limbo. That we couldn't receive the damages we wanted. And then, in the meantime, our building got condemned by the city. And so now we're living in this condemned slum. This is how it looked. We were living in these boarded up, abandoned complex. And this went on for a year. And we Christians thought, crap, we screwed up this community that was so tight, right? We had used all the power we had. We got a great attorney. I knew the city council member, and they brought in the inspectors to eventually condemn our building. We had a lot of media. And we were really sly about using the media because we always played up that we were multi-ethnic, and they always showed, cute kids who were sick and grandmas who were. We had all this worldly power, but now at this point, for a whole year, we lived in this abandoned-looking complex. And that's when we began to really, really pray. And so we Christians got together every morning, and we would pray the way Nehemiah prayed when he thought about Jerusalem. He wept over the conditions of Jerusalem, in the same way we wept over the conditions of Oak Park. He confessed his sins, Nehemiah, and we confessed our own sins. We were really angry at our landlord. We wanted justice, and we wanted him to be punished. And so we had to repent of our own sort of desire for revenge. We prayed for God's intervention for our neighbors who were really suffering because they were really poor and would have nowhere to go if we lost this lawsuit. And we asked for favor of the government, just the way Nehemiah asked for favor from the king. And so we prayed, and after a year, God intervened again. And we actually won the lawsuit. What happened was that our landlords didn't go to bankruptcy court. He didn't show up. And so when he didn't show up, our attorney worked with a city attorney who was named Johnny Angel. The attorney, usually creditors fight each other for money that they're fighting for, but we all worked together with the city, and we came up with a joint bankruptcy plan to say we're going to take over Oak Park if you, landlord, don't do anything about it, right? And so at that point, when the landlord was going to lose the entire apartment complex, all his property, he settled. And we basically won. We got $1 million worth of damages from him. We got him to sell the place. And you can see the building of the new place. The building got turned over to a nonprofit developer, so it became under good management. We got $1 million in damages. And then we also sort of changed some of the city policies. So it looks like God did this marvelous work. And the story should end now, and you should see, yes, if you pray, God will answer your prayers, and justice is won. But the story goes on, and then what happens next was unforeseen by us. And so what happened is that they rebuilt Oak Park, and it became really, really nice. People lived in a lot healthier conditions. Everybody got their own bedrooms because people were living like 12 to a one bedroom. Now each family had their own bedroom. It was clean, well managed. But ironically, what happened is that our refugee and immigrant neighbors became American, middle-class Americans. And instead of like hanging out in the courtyard and interacting a lot, they all retreated into their own private spaces, and kids would just play, video games all day. And the unintended consequence of winning the lawsuit and getting better housing was actually we lost our community. We would never have foreseen that. It was really ironic. The Christians got kicked out because we didn't meet the income guidelines. The place became better managed, and so when kids would hang out and bring their friends, they started clamping down on the kids, and then the neighbors started complaining about the kids too, and so they actually had to put up more security. So instead of living in the sort of fun apartment complex that was sort of the Wild West where you could run all over and climb on the roofs, now they had to live in this well-managed apartment complex. It was sort of like a prison for them. And so the question for me comes up, was justice really secured? Did we really win justice in this case? Right? It's a big puzzle, and I thought a lot about how do I see God work in this whole series of when we thought we were using the powers God's given us to seek his shalom. So as I'm writing a memoir about our stories in Oakland, our life in Oakland, and I think through this time of reflection and thinking a lot about what Beck Chom has taught me, I think his perspective really gives me insight and wisdom about how to relate and to understand what we went through. And so let me share with it. Jeremiah's letter to the exiles in 29 is pretty famous, right? You know that famous verse where I have plans for you, plans to prosper, and you guys are all seminarians. You probably I take that as my personal promise. I'm going to have this great church, or I'm going to have a personal calling. God's got a perfect spouse for me, or, he's got hope for me. I can get out of Conwell eventually, and, this is just a temporary thing. So a lot of times, that's how I read it in Jeremiah 29:11. God has this personal promise, special plan for me, and that's great. But as I read it more, and as I read it through the eyes of Beck Chwam, my refugee neighbor, I realized that God's promise in Jeremiah, his call for shalom, was radically more grand, more majestic, fulfills deeper longings than my own little personal hopes and dreams. So in Jeremiah, this is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says to those I carried away from exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. Build houses and settle down, plant gardens and eat what they produce. Marry and have sons and daughters, find wives for your sons and give your daughters in marriage, so that they too may have sons and daughters. Increase in number there, do not decrease. So this is what Jeremiah and refugees have taught me about seeking the shalom of the city. How do we do it? What do we look for? What are we going for if justice isn't really necessarily won? The first thing God tells them to do, in contrast to the other prophets who are saying, go back home as soon as you can, God says, stay. Plant yourself. Have families, right? What God is telling the exiles in Babylon back then was to settle down and invest in this particular community. Because you may have been removed from where you thought God was, but God is still with you, even in this hostile place. Even in this place where you meet so much oppression, where you meet so much unfairness, God is still with us. Instead, settle down and care about those around you. Invest in relationships. And this whole notion of having a family is what Beck Chom taught me. It's sort of interesting. When we organized our neighbors, the young people, we asked, why'd you join the lawsuit? And he said, oh, we wanted to have our rights, right? We have housing rights. We shouldn't live in such unfair conditions. And some of our neighbors said, oh, we joined the lawsuit because we trusted you. You lived with us for so long, Russell. Well, we'll just sort of go along with what you said. When I asked Beck Chom, why did you join the lawsuit? He gave this really remarkable response. He said, I felt sorry for you, Russell. And that's why I joined the lawsuit. I go, what do you mean by that? He goes, I saw you and the other Christians going door to door, knocking and struggling so much. I just wanted to help you guys out. I go, that's not fighting for justice. That's just like taking care of your family. And that's exactly what Beck Chom was doing. He joined the lawsuit not because he was defending his personal rights. He joined the lawsuit because he was treating me like family. And he felt sorry for me. And so in the Chinese character, it's like an elder taking care of the younger guy. He had this sense of family, and the reason why he joined the lawsuit was because he took the responsibility, the corporate responsibility, to do what's best for the community. Not thinking about himself, he acted out of reciprocity and corporate responsibility. And so that's the first notion of justice that Beck Chom taught me. In America, we think of justice a lot of times as individual rights, defense of rights. You know, that's how International Justice Mission works. It's all about defending rights. Beck Chom says, no, justice isn't only about rights. It's about our responsibility and our corporate responsibility to each other, to take care of each other, to seek each other's welfare first. So what I learned from Beck Chom is that God's justice, God's peace, isn't just about us feeling good about our rights, but it's us taking care of each other as family. It was sort of a mind-blowing shift. Jeremiah then says, seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I have carried you into exile. So not only do you settle down, but then you actually actively work and commit yourself to the city. Now, I'll be quick here. A lot of times when you do urban ministry and you study about urban ministry, there's different approaches, and one is sort of this optimistic, effective approach. Andy Crouch just wrote this book called Playing God. He says what we need to do is use our power, the power of institutions, and our power as trustees of institutions where we can actually make change. And that's one approach. We could use our power to change the city, right? And that's a pretty common approach. Because God is going to use the cities to change the world. Oops. The other approach is like, no, you can't change the world. The world's fallen. All the church can hope to be is to be faithful, right? And so the church then should be a countercultural colony, being a prophetic sign against the world. The world's corrupt. Give it up. Let's just be the church in the world, right? So these were the two approaches. I was really struggling about our lawsuit, and did we win, did we lose? Can we be effective in getting justice? And, can we be optimistic? Can we really transform the world? Like, there's all these slogans, transform the world for Christ, and like, is that possible, right? Or are we just going to be sort of ineffective and irrelevant? We could just be the church. And so I struggle with that issue. If you hope for effectiveness, you're going to get disillusioned and cynical. If you're going to just try to be faithful, you feel like, I'm sort of irrelevant, right? What Beck Chom taught me, let me tell you quickly, how much time do I have? You want to hear? Let me tell you what Beck Chom told me about. So later, I went to Beck Chom, and I said, during the bankruptcy period, we're going to get kicked out of Oak Park. what were you going to do if we lost our housing and you had to move out? And so I asked this old refugee elder guy, and he laughed. He goes, I was going to go live in a big house with you. And he was such a jokester, but he just had this sort of trust and obedience to the group. And I think that was how I think we should approach our work of justice and even of missions. That we don't know if we're going to be effective, but what we need to do is just be obedient and trusting. And if you're obedient and trusting in our justice work, then our hope is to be fruitful. We're not going to be fully effective, but we don't have to be necessarily irrelevant. We can be fruitful in our work of justice. And that's sort of the way I've come to see it. It's sort of this Asian balanced perspective that Baek Chwam taught me. That if you're righteous, if you're right living, if you take care of each other, then the fruit will be peace, God's shalom. So if we're obedient to God's call to be righteous, to live together in right relations, then God will bear the fruit. And we don't know what that fruit will be, right? We don't know if we're going to win lawsuits. We don't know if we're going to change the world. All we can do is be trusting, like Baek Chwam was, and resting God's bearing the fruit. It's the same way in missions, right? You don't know if you're going to be able to be effective in missions. You don't know if you're going to be effective in the marketplace. But all we can do is be faithful and trusting. Does that make sense to you guys? It really helped me think, I don't have to feel bad about, like, we screwed up this community, or, we just have to keep on being obedient. And finally, Jeremiah says to pray. Pray to the Lord for it, for the city, because if it prospers, you too will prosper. And this is the other revelation about doing justice work, is that prayer is a way to do justice. Because what is prayer but going before the high courts of heaven and speaking to the only lawgiver and judge? Doing justice means going to the judge and pleading for justice and mercy. And that's what I've come to realize. It's just like the persistent widow who knocks on the judge's door. That's how we should be approaching justice in this world, When we see so many people in Liberia facing Ebola, when we see people racially profiled in Ferguson, when we see the Hong Kong protests, we need to be constantly on our knees praying for them, because that's where our hope comes from. Andrew Murray writes that time spent in prayer will yield more than that given to work. Prayer alone gives work its worth and its success. Prayer opens a way for God himself to do the work in us and through us. So as we take positions of humility in our justice work, as we're constantly praying, again, it's God who bears the fruit. Again, what I've learned from Baek Chwam is that the peace we receive isn't an individualistic peace of mind. It's a collective peace. We can, as Christians, can only have peace if our brothers and sisters have peace, right? And so if our cities have peace, then we too can prosper. So just to sort of conclude and sum up, these are some of the things that I've learned from Baek Chwam and from the refugees I've been living with in terms of doing justice and seeking shalom in the city. As I grew up, I saw justice as an abstract concept. It's about being fair, about having my rights duly processed. In the Old Testament and the way Baek Chwam sees it, justice is a relational practice. It's an act of corporate responsibility. As I grew up, I thought justice is a defense of individual rights. But Baek Chwam taught me that justice comes from righteous obedience and trust in God. Even today, as we vote, we think justice could come about through the ballot box or through the courts. but we learned that justice isn't won, justice is granted from the high judge in heaven. So my encouragement to you guys today, as you seek the shalom of the city, is to claim God's promise. A lot of you guys may be international students and may be in a marginalized state. Maybe when you go over to missionaries, you'll feel out of place. That's how we as Christians should be. We don't belong to this world. I don't want to belong to this world. Where we live in Oakland, I see kids sold on the streets. Our youth director got killed by a hit and run guy in crystal meth. I don't want to belong to this world that's so violent, that's so corrupted. So having an exilic identity is a gift. It's a blessing because it gives me hope. It helps me realize I don't belong here. At the same time, God tells us to plant ourselves here, that we could be home even though we have a real home in heaven. So as we're exiled here, let's make the best of it. Let's bring the peace. Let's share the good news for everyone. And the great news is that someday Jesus is already preparing a place for us, a real home. And we have to live in that present future now, longing for the home to come, but being home here now. Amen?